Thank you. I must first air a grievance that whoever made the video chose the most unflattering pictures of me to add to the video. But now that you see me in person, I hope the impression would be somehow better. I must also thank, firstly, thank the Shivnadar Foundation for inviting me, but more importantly, I landed here in Chennai and discovered I had a bit of a health issue suddenly, and your doctor on campus helped, and even though I've been prescribed pills and so on, which apparently make me a little drowsy, hopefully I'll be able to get through the speech. In the event that I'm slurring or something, know that it isn't alcohol, it is simply antibiotics. So I'll begin with a simple, experience of my own, which drew me to history, because most of us, when we study history or read history in school, we tend to think of it as a boring subject, which is 5 dates, 3 emperors, 5 empires, the independence struggle, and that's it. Somewhere at 1947, history ends, and then the present begins. But for me, it was really a world of surprises, because like many people in India, my parents are from Kerala, but I grew up in another state. So I grew up in Maharashtra, and we had, textbooks from there. And we'd read in school when I was about in 7th standard, 2002 or so, we'd read about how, child marriage was this big thing, and social reformers came and changed it. Or widow remarriage was this big thing, and, it was really pulling us down as a society, and social reformers came and changed it. Except that I would go on holiday to Kerala, to my grandmother's place, and there we would hear stories about how Ammuma's Ammuma, which is grandmother's grandmother, my great-great-grandmother, was a divorcee in the 1880s. And I'd be like, wait, how was divorce even possible? Because here on the one hand, I'm learning in school that if a woman lost her husband, that was the end of her career, end of her life, end of her existence, and somehow she was just relegated to the background as a non-entity. And yet, here in Kerala, I'm hearing that great-great-grandmother had 2 husbands, and the second husband had also had a first wife before. Now, this drew me to actually asking questions about my own family, because we came from a matrilineal community where everything passes down the female line, which is to say that I belong not to my father's family, but to my mother's family. I belong not to my father's caste, but to my mother's caste. So much so that when my own father actually passed away a few years ago, we did have a small little debate within the family as to whether I was entitled to even do the ceremonies at the funeral, because traditionally the right goes to his sister's children, not to his own son. That was how the society was organized then. And this led to all kinds of interesting discoveries. So in my first book is on the royal family of Travancore and these internal court battles of the 1920s about power politics during the Raj. And if you look at these 2 women, they are basically exemplars of that matrilineal system. Because in the matrilineal system, it was not the king's wife who was called the queen or the Maharani. It was the women of the family and the king's sister. So brother and sister were the key figures, not husband and wife. The husband of the Maharani of Travancore would be called only the consort. He would not even be called the husband. The consort could not sit in the presence of his wife. The consort in public couldn't even call his wife by name. He had to say, Your Highness. They would not be allowed to travel in the same car, because if they did, a husband and a wife sitting next to each other would signify equality, but the husband was never the equal. So he had to follow in a smaller car behind rather than sitting in the same car with his wife. And if by some mistake he ended up in the same car, he had to sit opposite the wife, never next to her. This continued to the extent that if the husband of the Rani of Travancore was on his deathbed, he would be lifted with a cot and taken to his ancestral home to die, because only royalty could die in the palace and he was not royalty. So much so that, in fact, at feasts in the palace, we have these big Kerala sadhyas and so on, the Maharani would be served 4 payasams or 4 desserts. Her husband would get 2. Because, again, status determined all of these things. A relationship of marriage alone didn't mean much. What actually mattered was whether you were born into the right matrilineal family, and the children got everything from the mother. So the mother would be a highness, the children would be highnesses, the father would be Mr. whatever. There would be nothing beyond that in terms of status for the husband. They could be discarded easily. In my own great-great-grandmother's case, she was first married to a Brahmin, very nice man, they were very fond of each other, etc., etc. But what happened is that she got pregnant, she ended up coming back to her mother's house for the delivery, and while she was there, she went into labor, she had a child, it was a stillbirth, and it was a stillbirth of a girl. Now in the matrilineal system, if you have a stillbirth, that's bad enough, but if it's a girl, then it's also a bad omen. And so when the Brahmin husband came back, the mother-in-law and my great-great-grandmother's mother, she stopped him at the threshold and she said, there must be something wrong with you. That's why we've had this death of a girl child in the family, so we don't want you to come back. And he was sent away. That was all it took for marriages to be dissolved, which is ironic because, again, when I was studying in school, we would read news reports about how, faraway villages in upper India, women would be blamed if they didn't give birth to sons. Or if they kept having daughters, the husband's families would be cruel to them. Here it was a reversal of the case. It was the husband who was kicked out because somehow the daughter had died in birth. So these questions got me thinking, and I started wondering, what else do we not know about Indian history? What else is cut out from our textbooks? Now, the picture you see on your screen is one good story, which is, for example, just like this matrilineal system in Kerala. How many of us even realize that Africans were a big part of Indian history? You go to Uttar Pradesh, there's a place called Jaunpur, where there was African rulers at some point about 600 years ago. You go to Bengal, in the 1500s, there was an African clan that ruled over there. You go to Gujarat in Ahmedabad, and the great mosque over there was constructed by an African. And of course, the man you see on your screen is a man called Malik Ambar, the most glamorous of African figures in Indian history. Now, just to give you an illustration of where this man came from, he was born in Ethiopia, somewhere in the, let's say, 1550s maybe, as Chapu in the Oromo tribe. Somewhere when he was a kid, he was abducted, sold into slavery by somebody, and taken to Baghdad. There he becomes Ambar, he converts to Islam. He's sold again to a new master who brings him to India. Now, once he comes to India, he's purchased by the Peshwa of Ahmednagar. Peshwa means minister, and Ahmednagar is the Ahmednagar Sultanate. And this Peshwa buys him, except the Peshwa is also a black man, because the Peshwa had also come to India from Africa many years before in a similar kind of situation. Now, Chapu turned Malik Ambar works for this local man for a while. He's a military slave. These aren't slaves in the American way, where they were taken to America and they toiled on plantations or whatever. These are military slaves. So he fights, he starts building a crew of his own. Somewhere 20 years down the line, his master dies, and the master's widow gives him his freedom. Now this guy becomes a full-on mercenary. So he's got about 300 odd men, and with him, he's sort of going around the Deccan offering his services to whichever sultan wants him. By the 1590s, he's now approaching middle age. Suddenly his star is on the ascendant. Because what happens is Malik Ambar finds that the Mughal invasion of the Deccan, starting from Akbar's time, has caused collapse of political institutions and so on. So there's an opportunity there. And he's clearly got some capacity to lead, as a result of which the Marathas, local Muslims, the Dakhni Muslims, they all start gravitating towards him. So from 300, he has 600. From 600, he has 2,000. From 2,000, goes up to 10,000 soldiers. And soon, he's got up to 50,000 soldiers. Interestingly, one of his right-hand men is the grandfather of Chhatrapati Shivaji, a man called Maluji. Now, this African now stands for 25 years, from the years, let's say, 1600 to 1625, in the Mughal conquest of southern India via the Deccan. For 25 years, it's the African man who stands like a wall and prevents the Mughals from coming in. Usually, when we talk about Deccan history or Mughals and so on, we think of Shivaji coming up and resisting the Mughals, using the Marathas as his backing. But in reality, 2 generations before Shivaji, in his grandfather's time, Malik Ambar had already done this. So much so that Shivaji himself saw this African man as an inspiration. So if you look at a 1670s Sanskrit Mahakavya that was produced at Shivaji's court called the Shiva Bharata, Malik Ambar is praised in that poem. He's compared to the gods, to Kartikeya. He's called as radiant as the sun and so on and so forth, because Shivaji saw this as a very remarkable man. And Shivaji saw an African, of all people, as an inspiration in his own defense of the Deccan. And of course, the Mughals didn't like it. Just as Aurangzeb would call Shivaji the mountain rat, in Malik Ambar's time, Jahangir would go around calling Malik Ambar the black-faced man, that dreadful man. The word black was obviously used a lot. Jahangir went to the extent of even commissioning a painting in which he shows himself shooting an arrow at Malik Ambar's impaled head, which is actually just a fantasy, because the Mughal emperor never actually accomplished this task in real life. In real life, Malik Ambar lived to the age of 80-something and died comfortable in his fortress, and Jahangir could only create art pretending that he had won a victory over Malik Ambar. But, this is, of course, war and fighting and that kind of thing. But another thing that drew me was also, going back to the whole matrilineal thing I mentioned earlier, was the idea of women. which is that history is so often about men and their wars and their fighting and their ego battles and so on. Where were the women in this? And that, was always a wonderful question to ask, because you discover that women were not only present. If you don't see them, it's because the men often expunged their place in Indian history. And how did this happen? Now, this is a painting someone I know in Bangalore did of Ahalya from the epics. Now, usually what is the Ahalya story that we know? That Ahalya was married to this one sage. She was a very pavam lady. She used to, nicely serve her husband, very dutiful and all of that. And then one day, Indra saw her from when he was passing through the sky or something. She was exquisitely beautiful. So Indra decides he has to come and seduce this lady. So he comes, he's disguised as Ahalya's husband, and he walks into Ahalya's house. She's, as I said, very pavam. She doesn't understand that this is a disguise, and she falls for it. Now, when Ahalya's actual husband comes back, he curses her, saying, "You've now fallen in virtue," and she turns into stone, and Sri Rama comes later and liberates her, etc., etc. Except this is not the actual original story in the Ramayana. In the original story in the Ramayana, the story goes this way, that Indra does come to her disguised as her husband, but Ahalya sees through the disguise. She knows it is a disguise, she knows it is not her husband, and yet she allows herself to be seduced, which poses an interesting question. Why is it that the original Ramayana story was later changed to make Ahalya come across as this woman who was deceived, as opposed to a woman who had consciously chosen to commit adultery? Simple fact that earlier people were comfortable with the idea of women having desire, with the idea of women having some kind of sexual agency and autonomy, but in later times that changes, and suddenly women have to be these very pavam, poor, sweet little souls who have no idea, no sense of desire, no sense of their own autonomy. Think of the story of Shakuntala. We usually think of the Kalidasa version, the Abhijnana Shakuntalam, in which Shakuntala meets Dushyanta. He comes on a hunt, sees her, and he says, "Oh, you woman of wonderful thighs, I must marry you," and so on. And Shakuntala says, "Oh, no, I must ask my father, my relatives, all of that." And eventually he says, "No, Gandharva Vivaham and all that." And she says, "Okay, fine." He goes back, he gives her a ring, and he says that, "This ring is a token of my promise to you and my love for you," and all of that. Ahalya is lost in her thoughts one day. Another sage comes. The sage finds her like that, completely oblivious to him having walked into the ashram, and he curses her, saying, "Whoever you've been thinking about, he'll forget you." Now all her maid servants and friends come running because Shakuntala is in tears, and they tell her, "No, poor thing, she didn't know what she was doing. Why don't you forgive her?" At which point the sage says, "Okay, fine, I'll forgive her. When your beloved sees the ring, he will remember who you are." So the curse is sort of toned down. The full curse is lifted and the minor curse is placed. And then Ahalya goes to Dushanta's court. Of course, the ring gets lost. A fish swallows it. Dushanta doesn't recognize, Shakuntala. Shakuntala stands there, weeps in court, and her mother, an Apsara, comes and takes her away. That's essentially what happens. Then, of course, the ring comes back to the king. King later discovers that he had made a mistake, and he goes in search of Shakuntala. Now, of course, this is again not the original Mahabharata story. In the original Mahabharata, when the king comes to Shakuntala's ashram, her father's ashram, Shakuntala is not coy and innocent, and she doesn't need maid servants to talk for her. She talks to the king directly. King says, "I want Gandharva Vivaha." She says, "Fine, but first promise me that my son will be your heir." So she extracts a promise first before she has this relationship with the king. Then, of course, because it's also the epics, and strange things sometimes happen in the epics, she has a 3-year-long pregnancy. At the end of it, she goes to the court with her son. She's not pregnant or anything. She actually has her son with her. There is no curse. There is no ring. None of those things happen in the original Mahabharatam story. Instead, when she goes to Dushyanta's court, Dushyanta lies. He feels that, some stray woman has come into my court. Yes, I have history with her. But if I acknowledge her as my wife, what will my courtiers think? What will people say? Is essentially his attitude. And he therefore pretends he doesn't know Shakuntala deliberately. It's a conscious lie. And Shakuntala does not weep. She doesn't stand there like some damsel in distress, hoping for her mother to come and save her. She stands there and basically looks him in the eye and says, "Even without you, my son will rule. You rule the earth, I fly the skies." She is a defiant woman. And yet what you see is the epic version of a defiant woman who has agency, again, by the time of Kalidas, is turned into an innocent woman who has very little control over what she's doing, who's subject to curses, whose fate is in the hands of either divine forces or a man. There is agency is again removed from Shakuntala in this particular story. Which is, again, that's why historians, when we work with myths, this is one thing we study. How do the stories get retold over different periods of time? What is it that we choose to remember, and what is it that the original story might tell? And sometimes going back to the original will give custodians of Indian honor a bit of a heart attack, because they'll find that the original stories have happened to be quite colorful and vivid. Another picture, it'll come up on screen at some point, is that, these are, of course, epic women, right? What happened to actual women in politics and actual women in Indian history? As I was alluding to earlier, they would sometimes be written out of history consciously. So in the Ahmednagar Sultanate, where Malik Ambar worked, a generation or two before him, there was a queen mother called Kunza Humayun. She was married to the Sultan. There's all kinds of interesting stories, and how they were very fond of each other and so on. And there was a manuscript created called the Tariq-e-Nizam Shahi, which is about this dynasty. And this manuscript was full of pictures of the king, the queen, in various settings, out in the garden, sitting with their courtiers and so on. Except that this queen, her husband dies, she starts to rule, and after 6-7 years, her son comes to power, but realizes that mummy is quite a force. Mummy doesn't want to give up power. So the son starts resenting his mother. And at that point, a number of these pictures are pulled up, and Kunza Humayun is turned into a blob, which is to say, all pictures in which she appears, her son gets somebody to basically scratch her out, paint her out of the painting, so that you have pictures of the king, and next to the king, you'll see a big blob where it used to be his wife, where it used to be Kunza Humayun. You have cases where we think, women, these Indian women, in especially politically powerful women, they were all stuck in parda, and therefore what power and agency did they have when they were stuck in parda? Actually, plenty, because Emperor Akbar's Rajput wife, Mariam-uz-Zamani, who's popularly called Jodhabai, but that's not actually her name, she was a Parda woman. She used to be in Parda in a harem, but she owned one of the biggest trading ships in the world. She had huge economic enterprises. She had a cavalry rank of 12,000. That, by the way, is Kunza Humayun, the blob next to the king that I was referring to earlier. There used to be an actual lady there who's now turned into a bolster and some kind of, roundish figure over there. So Akbar's wife had trading enterprises. She had diplomatic position. She had a military rank. Go down to the Marathas. There was this queen called Tarabai who was similar. She was married to Shivaji's son Rajaram. He ends up dying rather young. For 15 years, this woman holds the fort. She stays in control. She's got a rival wife and her son to deal with. She's got Shivaji's older son's wife and that one's child to deal with, the rival centers for power. She clings to power for 15 years, ultimately fails, and she's pushed off the throne. Some 30 years pass, but this woman has not given up her sense of ambition. 30 years after she's been removed from the political scene, she discovers an opportunity because the then Maratha king dies without an heir. And she says, here's my opportunity. And she says, well, you don't have an heir. I'll tell you one. I had a grandson years ago, and I secretly went and hid him away. And they say, okay, great. You've got a prince of royal bloodline. You've hidden away. Bring him to the court. She brings him to the court, and her plan, of course, is to put this boy on the throne and then work him like a puppet. So she's the one actually in charge. Except that having put her puppet on the throne, puppet turns out to have a spine and says, no, I'm not going to be worked by you. At which point Tarabai comes back and says, oh, no, this isn't my grandson. I just picked him off the street. He's some random person and so on. It basically tells you that even behind limitations like parda, even behind what we think somehow kept women, let's say, in the back seat, there were always ways to subvert this. Sometimes we don't even need to look into history books. Just ask our own family members. That is, if you can have such open conversations with your grandmothers and so on, as I can. My grandmother would tell me how when she was a young girl, whenever women had their periods, they would have to go and sit in a separate room because they were considered impure, ashuddham. And of course, she was a young girl. She didn't like this custom very much. So every time she was forced to go and sit in that room, as soon as her family members went to the other wing in the house where everybody ate, and she wasn't allowed to go there because she was impure, she would slowly come out of this room, go around running around the house, touching everything, making everything ashuddham, her father's clothes, her father's desk, everything, and then come and secretly sit back in the room. I thought it was just perhaps an exaggerated story, but then I read the memoirs of a lady called Devaki Nilayangod, which is equally amusing because she's a Brahmin woman. She was also put away in one of these rooms every time she had her periods. And the thing is, these Brahmin women weren't allowed to study, they weren't allowed to read. So basic literacy was there, but there was no question of reading newspapers or magazines or any of that. Except they discovered that the one place where the men weren't nosing around and policing them was this room where they would sit for their periods. So every time they had their periods, they would go into this room. That is when they would get all this contraband literature. That is when they would read the newspapers, the magazines, and all of that. But again, they were Brahmin women, so they were also orthodox. So they felt, well, we are Ashuddham, so how can we touch paper and a book, because the book is Saraswati. So they would get maidservants to come in and turn the pages for them, and that's how they would read. It tells you a little bit about the pure energy that human beings have, which is, and no matter how much you try to clamp it down, there is always ways in which people will push back against it. One of my favorite poems from the Bhakti literature. With Bhakti, we usually think is gods and people singing praises of gods and so on. But there's one Bhakti poet called Janabai in Maharashtra, say about 600 years ago. And my favorite poem from Janabai begins with the simple line, God, do me a favor and kill my mother-in-law. God, while you're at it, kill my father-in-law, sister-in-law, brother-in-law. She wants to kill everybody in the family. Now, the irony again is that Janabai is not actually married. She's an unmarried kitchen maid. But what she's basically communicating is that I, as a woman, am forced to stick to the kitchen, whereas the men in this household have the capacity to go out and engage with the intellectual world. I have a claim to intellect also. I have a claim to expressing ideas also, but I can't, and this is my form of showing defiance. So in her poetry, when God appears before her, it's not in some great form and awe-inspiring Maharupam or anything. God appears to help her clean lice from her hair, to sort of clean up the rice that she's cooking, to chop vegetables for her. That's how she envisions God, because that is the world she's trying to communicate. Somebody like Mirabai, we think of her as Krishna Bhakta. She's singing praises of Krishna, wandering saint, how sweet. But that's the thing. In sweetifying Mirabai, we've actually forgotten the potent, powerful Mirabai that existed, who was the wife of a Rajput prince. He dies and they tell her, now you must commit sati. And she says, I will not commit sati. Then they say, okay, well, you must live like a widow and not meet anybody else. She says, no, I will meet whoever I want. You must not dance around. She says, no, I will dance. And so eventually they try to poison her. They send a serpent into her bedroom and all of that. She simply doesn't die. She simply refuses to obey. Finally, she walks out of that palace and becomes a wandering saint. So she's not simply about Krishna Bhakti and singing bhajans. She's also standing up to a patriarchal order and pushing the boundaries and actually walking out of it. There is a choice she's made. In South India, you have a similar story with Akka Mahadevi, who refused to even wear clothes. The story goes she would cover herself with her hair. And she also walked out of a palace and then found her way through life. On the theme of women, I'll continue and give you one more story, which is, after Me Too came up a few years ago, I couldn't help but think of a parallel again from Kerala, where around 1905, there was a Nambudri Brahmin woman who was caught committing adultery. Now, these Brahmin women lived in seclusion. They were not supposed to have any dealings with any men. And, so they said, now you must have a trial. Adultery is a punishable offense. And she says, fine, let there be a trial, but I must be given a chance to interrogate the men also, because adultery includes, there's obviously a man also involved. So the Raja of Cochin, who's the local authority, says, fine, you can bring in the men also. Except that this lady, whose name was Kureda Tatri, brings out a list of some 66 men. And she says, well, you're going to try me? These are the 66 names you've got to bring, because all of these people have committed adultery with me. And obviously, this is quite shocking. Everybody's scandalized, because this includes a prominent actor in Kerala, Kathakali actor from that time. It includes a mahoot. It includes relatives. It includes all kinds of people. And this was the first time this was actually covered in the press. So the Malayalam Manorama and all kinds of local newspapers covered this, let's say, early 20th century version of Me Too. And it's amazing to read the material there, because they say at points this lady, Kureda Tatri, would reply like a barrister, which is that she would counter-interrogate these men, because they would come and they say, we deny all your allegations, we've never even met you. And then Kureta Tatri would say, oh, but you have a mole on your thigh there, you've got a birthmark on your arm here, and she would come up with evidence to show that she knew these men, and not just knew them intimately. And of course, the story has a rather funny ending, which is that she got to 64 names, by which time the scandal grew so horrible and it was getting all over the press, that the Maharaja of Cochin said, enough, this trial has taken down 64 prominent men, no more. And that's why the story goes, the next name was the Raja's name. That's why he stopped the trial over there. Now, this obviously begs the question as to when did we become so uncomfortable with many, many topics that, frankly, today, if one were to write about, talk about, it would get one into, let's say, sensitive political waters. It could be about caste, it could be about beef, it could be about women, it could be about any theme, but somehow we now have thin skins when it comes to a lot of these things. One answer is obviously colonialism, because we think of colonialism as something where foreigners come, they conquer our land, and that's about it. But colonialism was also a psychological conquest. It was also about conquering our minds and the way we think about the past, the way we think about who we are, and what we decide is good and what we decide is bad. Now, in Indian traditions, especially by the medieval period, God wasn't seen as somebody very distant from us. God was believed to be in every human being, and therefore God was also seen as a very relatable figure. So if you look at the poems of Kshetraya and that generation in Telugu, they're basically seeing God in a very, very personal form. So you can berate God, you can yell at God, you can say, there are poems in which God is shown as coming to a courtesan, and the courtesan berates God saying, I saw you yesterday going to that one's house, why have you come to my door today? You know, where is my payment for last time? That's the kind of conversation you're having with God. God has been personalized to that extent. And yet, by the 19th century, under colonialism, with the Victorian influences coming in, with people having, let's say, slightly more Protestant ideas of what God should be like, we ourselves started to get very ashamed of many of our own religious traditions. We ourselves started censoring things. So a lot of these bhakti poets, we started inventing metaphorical, esoteric ideas where they were actually just expressing desire and affection for God in a very human, sensual tone. We were never ashamed of it. In the 18th century, since we are in Tamil Nadu, there was in Tanjavur a lady called Muddu Palni who wrote a text called the Radhika Santwanamu, which is basically about Krishna and Radha, and Radha's just got Krishna married to her niece or something. And the moment she gets the marriage done, Radha's full of envy. Now she feels that, she's lost Krishna forever. Krishna's now got a new, younger wife. Radha's an older woman, and she's full of, anxiety. And the rest of the poem is about how Krishna has to win her back, including through desire and seduction and all of that. And Radha's pleasure is what matters, not Krishna's. Now this, by the 19th century, so embarrassed, well, Indian men, as always, that when the Radhika Santhanambu by Muddu Palani was first translated, they actually changed the name to Muddu Pillai because they wanted it to look like a man wrote this, not a woman, because they thought women writing about things like desire would somehow be shocking. We think of people in the past as having very erect spines, super serious all the time, always performing their rituals, not having a sense of humor, living almost like they belong to a different planet. That's not how it worked. They had a sense of humor. They had a life. They weren't always following the rules. They were often breaking the rules. And one example is, since we saw Shivaji's image on the screen earlier, Shivaji's own nephew. And this is one of my favorite bits from that period, from the early 18th century. So Shivaji's nephew was this king called Shahu in Tanjavur, again Tamil Nadu. And in the early 18th century, he wrote a Telugu play. Now this is again multilingual stuff, So he's a Maharashtra origin king whose mother tongue is Marathi. He lives in Tamil Nadu, his subjects are Tamil. He writes in Telugu because Telugu is the court language. And of course he knows Sanskrit also. And his courtiers also include Rajputs, Afghans, and a whole host of people. In this multicultural world, he comes up with this play that he writes. And in the play, you have a Brahmin called Moru Bhatlu the Magnificent on his way to a temple festival. Now, on the way to the temple festival, he's got his chela with him, a disciple. And Moru Bhatlu sees in the distance a very beautiful woman. And Moru Bhatlu tells his disciple, look, I want to go and flirt with that lady. Now, the disciple says, no, you're a great Pandit. Think of the Vedas, think of philosophy. Why are you thinking of women and desire? At which point, Moru Bhatlu says, no, I don't want eternal bliss and all that. I want the bliss that comes with spending an evening with this lady. So they have to go, and the chela is like, now what do I do? My master is going to embarrass himself. The lady looks around, and she looks at this Brahmin, and first she says, oh, look, I'm married, so I can't flirt with you. He says, no, marriage is not a problem. Give me your loins as you would give land to a Brahmin. Think of it as charity. At which point the lady says, now how to get rid of this man? Seems very insistent. So she says, well, I'm lower caste compared to you. I belong to the leather worker caste. You're a great Brahmin, so we can't have any dealings. At which point Moru Bhatlu says, no, this caste and all we created just like that. It's to hoodwink people. You come with me. Finally, in desperation, the woman says, we are a Dalit community, so we drink liquor and we eat beef. Therefore, we're not pure enough for you. And Moru Bhatlu says, I drink milk and I worship the cow. You eat the whole cow. You must be purer than me. Now, this was written by Shivaji's nephew, Chhatrapati Shivaji's nephew in the early 18th century here in Tamil Nadu. If I were to write this today, people would throw stones at me or do worse because somehow we have lost that sense of the capacity to laugh at ourselves. And what does the capacity to laugh at ourselves actually indicate? It indicates a confidence in your own culture. It indicates security. It indicates that nothing can shake us. It doesn't matter if we are able to poke fun at our own jokes, at our own habits, at our own castes, at our own customs. This play wasn't just for the king's private titillation. It was performed in temples in front of huge audiences. It was about people having a laugh just as all of you laughed just now. And that, I think, is what makes history fascinating. The fact that every time we go digging beyond the surface, we find things that are going to be surprising, things that are going to push against ideas that we have and preconceived notions that we have, as opposed to things that will confirm our existing ideas of the world. That is what makes it rich. And I'll end with this gentleman on the screen, and on the theme of colonialism itself, which is, again, we now in the 21st century, as we're coming up in the world and we've got nationalism and all of this, we like to think of the world in very simple ways, right? So colonialism was bad, and we were oppressed by people, and that was it. But what you see in this picture is an Indian minister, I think in Andhra Pradesh, the irrigation minister, putting a garland on the statue of an Englishman. There's an estimated 3,000 statues in the Andhra region to this one Englishman whose name was Sir Arthur Cotton, which makes you think, why is it that even in 21st century India, we're still garlanding an Englishman, somebody who came from Britain, somebody who's part of the colonizing power that dominated us for a good 250 years? Simple answer, because the peasants there see him almost as a god. Why? Because this was the man who built an entire canal system, entire irrigation system over there, and brought water to them. Now, this is not to say that he wasn't representing a bad force. Colonialism was bad, it was oppressive. But again, within the story, there are so many layers to it that we discover, again, there are no simple answers. Peasants, even now, worshipping an Englishman is because he gave something tangible. If somebody else had done it, they would perhaps be worshipping that figure. But this is what matters. Lord Curzon, we know Lord Curzon usually in our textbooks as this evil figure who said nasty things about Indians, and he got the partition of Bengal done on religious grounds, etc. But the thing is, he was definitely a slightly hoity-toity man. He definitely had a sense that he was superior and white people were superior. But he applied those standards to himself also. So when some soldiers of the British Indian Army raped a Burmese woman, he was the only person in the entire British establishment who went up and said they have to be punished. It can't be, you can't let them go simply because the lady was, as they used to say in those days, black, and these guys were white soldiers. Eventually, he gets that entire regiment, shipped out to a horrible posting, simply because that's as far as he can push for some kind of punishment for these white troops. So colonialism also led in some ways to the creation of our identity in today's world. Why am I giving you the speech in the English language? Because English was the link language that came up in the 19th century. When the very first meeting of the Indian National Congress took place in 1885, the circular said, all delegates who come for this meeting must be conversant in the English language. Why? Because if someone coming from the Madras Presidency, somebody else is coming from Peshawar, somebody else is coming from Bengal, somebody else has come from Malabar, someone else has come from Bangalore, what is the common language these people have? Nothing. It was the English language that was there. It was the English language and the colonizers' grammar book that we seized, reclaimed for ourselves, and we used against the colonizer to fight them back. So in today's times, when there's a bit of, let's say, romanticization of the past, as if the past is this wonderful place and colonization came and ruined it, things are a little bit more complex. Things aren't necessarily as they always seem. Simple answers are not essentially what history is ever going to supply you. Instead, good history is the kind of history that actually makes you ask more questions. It's something that actually makes you think more about the past. It makes you think about what people in the past might have been like, what their motivations were, and so on. And I'll just end on one final note on thinking of historical figures. We live in times, in fact, I was just yesterday reading an article about a minister in Karnataka who said something about Tipu Sultan, and said, this coming election is a war between those who worship Tipu Sultan and those who sing the bhajans of Ram, as if, it's a simple binary like that. And this always poses questions for historians, right? How do you grapple with complicated, controversial figures like Tipu Sultan? Simple. The way we do it is simply by putting them in context. Did Tipu Sultan invade places like in Malabar and force people to convert to Islam? Yes, he did. At the same time, did Tipu Sultan sell Shivalingas and call for pujas to be done to Hindu gods within Karnataka at the Sringeri Matha? Yes, he did. Was he resisting the British in a way that nobody else had before him, and therefore was he a national icon? Yes, he was. At the same time, did he persecute people in the name of religion? That is also true. The simple thing is that it is not an either-or situation. Historical figures are a weird amalgam, a weird compound of all of these negative and positive qualities, and that is what we are trying to understand when we look at historical figures. If you want simple black and white answers as to this is a good historical figure, that is a bad historical figure, that makes for good politics and good political rhetoric, but it isn't good history. Good history is about identifying people in their context, understanding the complexity of their world, and not always judging them for good or bad. Kings were never sweet people. They tended to be violent. Even the best of them tended to be violent. Kings tended, just like politicians even now, to use religion for political purposes. If it happens now, why is it so surprising that it happened 200 years before us? So, as I was saying earlier, I think the answer to any history, if you ever do at the end of this session go back to history and pick up history books, is to ask questions of the past, not necessarily seek answers. I think I'll end with that. We've got a moderated segment of this chat next, I think. And again, forgive me if any of this seemed a bit too much. Because of my illness, I'm not entirely sure how good my performance here has been today. Thank you.
Thank you, Manu, for unraveling such interesting aspects of history for us. Now I invite on stage Colonel Gopal, CEO of Shivnara Schools, for a short fireside chat with Mr. Manu. Last I heard, Colonel Gopal read Manu's book, The Ivory Throne, recently.
Firstly, Manu, absolutely dazzling. Thank you so much. I mean, it was like a top class.
And I don't know if you're being sweet by saying that, because for someone full of antibiotics at the moment, I don't know if I was dazzling, but thank you.
Well, we've got to figure what you're going to be without the antibiotics then. It was just fantastic. There are a couple of personal stories, but I also realized while listening to you that I'm going to cut short this exchange and leave it to the audience also. But I must tell you, I'm a Malayali who did not live in Kerala or study in Kerala. I had a great-grandmother, my grandfather's mother, who was married when she was 16 to a 60-year-old man, and in 1 year told her brother that this guy is no good. And my grandfather never had a father because my uncle, my grandmother's uncle, just threw him out. So that's very much part of what you were saying about alternate history. And the other thing which irks me a little bit is that I live in a 150-year-old Nair house, and there's only one sister, and she's going to get the house, and not the boys, you know.
That's true. We have that as well. My mother, being a daughter, has 2 houses. Sister gets the big one, I get the small one.
So I think we are all torn between knowing more about the history that is undiscovered, and you're sort of unraveling it for us, and so also knowing a little more about you, the 33-year-old who's written 5 incredible books. And I got this 6 months ago. I didn't read it till Sundar's team said that I'm supposed to have this, so I did speed reading. But
I mean, you didn't choose my heaviest book, actually. This is a 700-pager. I've written shorter books since.
I know. But let's do an audience poll. How many have Manu's books bought or read? How many intend to buy them and read them? So you can see that's happening, right? But I think there's several things to ask you. But let's just talk about you a little bit. You're 33. You did not, and we are all educationists, you did not study history formally at college. You didn't do it in your master's. You did economics and international relations. And at 25, you started writing. And in 7 years, you've written 4 books on history. How did that happen?
Well, as I was saying earlier, you know, it was originally just the wonderful stories I would hear around me. A lot of it had to do with going back to Kerala in the summer, simply because at our ancestral place, we had what we call a grove. in which there were all kinds of gods. So there was a tribal god of a certain tribal community. There was a Durga who needed a roof over her head. There was another Bhadrakali who did not want a roof over her head. There were serpent gods. There were all these, there was a mix of so many deities, and all of them had their stories. And if you would ask elders in the family, they'd say, oh yeah, that particular goddess came to our family, and this is the story. Oh, the other goddess came at a later time, and this is her story. The tribal god used to belong to a tribe that actually used to live here. We kicked them out and we took the land, but we kept their gods. It just gave me a sense that somewhere in that agrarian ecosystem of an ancestral village, there were all these castes, all these communities, all these gods jostling for space. There's a Shasta, which is like a Ayyappan, I suppose, is the same. And the way you worship the Shasta is you go up and you clap 100 times and grin like an idiot. And that's how you do puja to the Shasta. There's nothing else. It's just 101 claps and grinning. In other places, they do a full pal abhishekam with milk and all of that. It's a very Brahminical ceremony. Other gods require blood and meat and sacrifice and alcohol. And watching this happening almost simultaneously just got me thinking about who are these people, what do these rituals represent, what do these gods represent? And that, I think, triggered an interest in the region. It triggered an interest in my own family. It triggered an interest in family stories. And again, because my grandmother's the type to tell stories without censoring very much, I got some very interesting insights about my own ancestors and rather naughty things that they did when they were young people. And you discover that these people from earlier generations, we now put them on pedestals as grandmother, grandfather, great-grandfather. They were just ordinary human beings going about their lives in their time. They had similar issues, they had similar weaknesses, they had similar strengths to all of us today. So when I heard that, oh yeah, grandmother's younger uncle was a bit of a flirt and littered the entire village with illegitimate children, I thought, oh, okay, interesting, interesting guy. The older uncle married 4 times, discarded 3 wives for all kinds of petty reasons, because one had bad teeth, one did something else, one dared to wear slippers and walk around the house in front of him with slippers on, and he thought, how dare she do this? I thought, okay, interesting figure again. Another aunt of my grandmother's married one man, got there, found the brother more interesting, ditched the earlier husband, married the brother. And I was like, who are these people? It's so different from our stereotypical image of what people and our ancestors are like. And I think breaking that stereotype, a bit of irreverence towards the past helps. Because being too reverential towards the past also clouds our capacity to see it for what it is. There's a kind of rose-tinted romantic lens that we apply to the past in such cases, whereas in reality, the past isn't about romance. The past is interesting. And romance somehow sort of, whittles down the interesting elements of it. So it was just asking questions around all that.
So, through that curiosity to know more, this unknown part of many parts of Indian history, just tell us about the research part. I mean, how do you get these stories out? Where do you get them from? Other than anecdotal, but you've researched in London apparently, but just where's all this research from?
So a historian would ordinarily look at multiple sources, right? So we'd look at archival material, depending again on the period. So for this book, The Ivory Throne, this is very much in the late 19th and early 20th century. So there's a lot of archival material. There are files, there are regular reports, there's routine correspondence that's happening, there are secret files, there's intelligence reports. There's also private material. So there's diaries of people, there's letters. So in these princely courts that existed in India, the British would place somebody called the British resident, like an ambassador. And the resident would send periodic reports to the viceroy every 2 weeks, the fortnightly report. But for all you know, the resident would have a lot more juice in the letter he wrote his mother. And the British had this wonderful habit of archiving all these things. So prominent men's private papers are available often in public archives. And you discover that what they put in the official report is a very summarized, succinct idea of things. And then they'll write a letter to their wife or their mother or some personal acquaintance, and there'll be a lot more material there. So it's that kind of stuff. It's also a lot of other evidence. For example, mythology. Myths are also speaking to us. It's not necessarily a question of whether the story actually happened as a myth suggests. The question really is what is the myth trying to tell you? What is the myth trying to communicate to you? That, if you discover, mythology also starts speaking to you. Art. Art tells you many things about what people were thinking. Art tells you about what they were wearing, how they wanted to be presented, what the social mores of that time were. Speaking of Tipu Sultan, he has this summer palace in Srirangapatna, and there's a beautiful wall mural there showing him winning the Battle of Pollalur in 1780. And it's the most striking mural painting because what you see is Carnage, absolute carnage. Heads have been cut off, arms are missing. For every missing head, you'll find a headless body somewhere in the painting. So it's all mathematically accurate. And in this painting, Tipu Sultan is shown sitting on an oversized oversized horse smelling a rose, as if he's in a garden and he's winning. No, so he's completely confident of everything, even in the middle of all this bloodshed. And the English colonel, his enemy, is shown sitting in a palanquin chewing his nails. Now, it's a way of understanding, that one painting is a way of understanding what the king thought of himself, what he's trying to communicate, what he's trying to project out into the world. It's propaganda art. The Shivaji's nephew's play that I mentioned, if I were to understand King Shahu of Tanjore purely through his political orders and edicts and that kind of stuff, I'd get a very dry version of the king in the 18th century. It's precisely his creative writing in Telugu in the form of this irreverent play about caste and beef that you get an insight into his mind and you realize, hold on, this man was a quite creative, interesting kind of figure. So fiction, poetry, art, buildings, all of these things come into good research that is trying to understand the full picture as opposed to isolated parts of it alone.
So one part of this is the wonderful story of the Travancore Princess Lakshmi Bai's friendship with the Cooch Behar princess. I'm sure the audience will love to hear a little bit about that. Where do you find that? And
yeah, so again, we think that when the British were in power in India, they somehow were this very powerful force and fully in charge and control. They were an extremely paranoid force, which is why a lot of their intelligence reports make for fascinating reading, because the British Empire was also this massive machinery for hoovering up gossip. They would find gossip on anything, everything, who was where, who was sleeping with whom, who went out and ate what the rituals of a place were. And you find that kind of information. So there's plenty of anecdotal information of that kind collected by the British themselves in a way to find out what are the weak spots of your political opponent. So when Gandhiji would do his famous fasts unto death, the British would actually inquire, are they feeding him glucose water? Because he's having only water. Is there glucose in the water? And there are actual files discussing whether or not Gandhi on his fast is having glucose water. Because every small little detail is a source of power over your enemy. So, what their tastes are, what their illnesses are, whether they're capable of wielding power, who are the ones they are close to. All of these come into play because it's about power and power politics. So the archival material is actually quite fascinating and very, very rich.
so we were in conversation in the morning with a brilliant young filmmaker, and this looks like a terrific Netflix series. So is that happening?
It's been optioned for a web series, but that's only step one in a process that involves, they have to make a mood board, there's a screenplay, scripting, this, that, and then the platforms come on. Something is happening, but I'm not sure at what stage it's reached. But at the moment, yes, this book is being turned into something.
So, we are all educators here, universities, schools, etc. And as I sort of dabble in teaching history here and there with students, but I always try to explain to them why read history. It would be great to hear you, why read history. One of the things we talked backstage is that our whole understanding of Indian history from a structured classroom experience ended with 1947. Except for the few students who choose to read history subsequently after grade 11 or so. Otherwise, we have no, except WhatsApp, which tells us apparently what history is after that. But, from you, it'll be nice to hear from a young person, why read history?
Simple question with a simple answer, actually, because the fact is, history isn't just about the past. It is also what illuminates why the present is the way it is. Why do we, as I was saying earlier, why are we having this conversation in English? Why did English become the link language? If it weren't English, what would have been our link language? People sometimes think it would be Sanskrit or something, but no, it would have been Persian, because Persian was the link language till the 1830s. Why are our political institutions the way they are? Why do we have democracy put up from the top in the constitution, but also from below penetrated by caste and religion and all kinds of things? Why is corruption such a big problem in the country? Why are our buildings shaped the way they are? Why are our cities designed the way they are? Who built these cities? Everything in the present, the foundations of the platform on which we are actually sitting and constructing meaning for ourselves in the present, all of this is derived from history, which is why history is also a political battlefield, because how you understand the past determines how you behave in the present, and it determines what future will emerge, because of our conversations and because of our ideas. Constantly, politicians end up fighting over history precisely out of the awareness that this is actually not about what happened 3,000 years ago or 500 years ago. This is about the present, and it is about the shape the future will take. That is why history matters. If our idea of the past is lopsided and mixed up and not necessarily clear, we are susceptible to creating a future that would be potentially problematic. Whereas on the other hand, if we are aware of the past, we understand it in all its complexity, we'd be much more confident in the present, and we'd be able to shape a future also with the same amount of confidence.
Yeah. So there's one thing which clearly emerges from your short life as a historian, but a prolific life of 5 books which have been extremely well received. I would say it's a bit Bollywood in terms of the way people are reading, buying Manu Pillai's books. Do you think there's a case for what's sort of happening in conversation now, that we need to rewrite history, or is it also, which could be the other part, which is, do we need to just know the history which we had forgotten, and there's parts to be filled up?
This whole we need to rewrite history is interesting because it assumes that history has been written once and that is it. And nobody has rewritten it since then, which is not true. History is about constant rewriting. So my PhD dissertation is about nuancing an argument somebody else would have made earlier. It's about adding to the discourse. Every history book that comes out is essentially retelling a story from a new perspective or with new evidence or something or the other. The very field, the very discipline of history is what? It's about constantly rewriting the past and trying to understand it better and better and better. A typical example I give is about 100 years ago, there was a historian called Sir Jadunath Sarkar. There was a man called Sar Desai. That generation of historians, if you ask them to think of the feminist perspective in history, they wouldn't have even understood what that meant, because that perspective did not exist in their time. Today, we can't do history without thinking of the women in the past, simply because perspectives have changed, a new lens has been added. So where they wrote about, say, Mughals and saw it purely as a world of men, today historians writing about the Mughals also focus on the harem, also focus on the women, and also focus on what they were doing. And they've discovered actually these women had lots of political influence. They weren't just locked up in some room waiting for the Sultan to come and the emperor to come and spend time with them. No, they were powerful women. So changing perspectives, changing ideas mean that constantly history is bound to be rewritten. It's just that some people think that history has to be rewritten from a new ideological position. There's an old ideology that dominates, therefore new ideology has to come and correct it or whatever. That just creates lopsided history. If you're saying there's an ideological slant to earlier history, the answer to that can't be new ideology, because then you're just skewing it in another direction. So history is about finding balance and being led by the evidence to the best of your capacity. There's always going to be some measure of bias, because historians are also human beings. We are also creatures of our own time and upbringing and all kinds of other influences. As a result of which, there's always going to be some level of bias that comes into our work. But we are trained to try and minimize the bias and keep it 95% at least objective. And the 5% window is for accident. Despite your best efforts, if some bias gets in, that's unfortunate, but that's just how it is.
Okay, I think I'll open this to the audience. Just before that, so that's just to get you warmed up, that please prepare your questions. But do you think in our Indian context of studying history at the school, college level, do you think South Indian history is generally neglected, or it's less known?
It is.
Like there's this book called The Coromandel, I'm sure you would have heard.
Yes, I've read it.
It's fascinating.
By Charles Allen. Yeah. No, you're right. There tends to be a north focus in a lot of history. Some of it is partly because the north is where the capital is. That's where power resides, and therefore there's an overwhelming influence and that the north has on what gets told and what stories receive currency. The other thing also is that people say, oh, the Mughals, we are obsessed with the Mughals, and there's so many other stories. Why aren't they being told that much? Well, the simple reason is we're obsessed with the Mughals because the Mughals were around till 1858. So the records that are available are extremely rich, extremely detailed, and very recent, about 200 years. They were there till as recently as that. Whereas if you say Vijayanagara and so on, Vijayanagara collapsed in the 17th century. We don't have the same amount of literature, we don't have the same amount of art, we don't have the same amount of material. The further you go back in time, it becomes more and more difficult to resurrect the past because your material becomes more and more slender. So that's definitely a factor. But outside of official narratives, I think plenty of attention is now being drawn south because people have realized that we can't keep retelling the same stories. When there are so many stories to be told from different parts of the country, each better than the other, I think there'll automatically be a kind of course correction.
Right, fascinating. Thank you so much. Yes, yes.
So, what is obvious is, according to the period, the story gets modified. So, what is the responsibility of current historian, you and the other your comrades, in the context of writing today's history? How would you like to, so that it gets portrayed in the right?
So exactly, right? We're not making a choice between the earlier version and the later version. Our job is to highlight that both versions exist, and this is the difference between both versions. The job of the historian is not to say, oh, that Shakuntala was better than this Shakuntala, or this Shakuntala is better than that one. On the contrary, it is simply informing the public that there are these two versions, both versions are communicating something slightly different, and you can then, you can make of it what you will, is the kind of attitude and answer that is given.
My question was about how you are, as a historian, collecting today's stories for future generations in that context.
That's true. I mean, although I wouldn't say we are collecting today's stories, but in future, when somebody, for example, 50 years from now reads my books, they will identify in my books certain trends from the present also, which I may not be aware of. I might be completely oblivious to certain influences in my work, but somebody writing from a distance of 50 years in future will be able to point that out, just as I am now pointing out the difference between the two Shakuntalas. That is possible. But we ourselves aren't, actively archiving the present. That's more a journalist's job. We are very much speaking about the past. And journalists, I suppose, are creating records of what's happening in the present and in today's world, which future generations will use as their material.
Hi, I have a question.
I can't see you.
Here.
Where? There.
Here, I'll stand. So interesting use of images. So what caught my eye was the Ahalya image. Can you tell us something about the image and why you thought it was the, let's say, the appropriate representation of Ahalya in your presentation?
Oh, well, that was just the image that I had of Ahalya.
But what was the thought process for you to select that image?
Yeah, one can't find too many images of Ahalya considering she's an epic woman. There are some cartoonish images. This is an oil painting. But what I found interesting is that there was an expression of defiance on her face, which is what drew me to that picture, which was the artist's idea in the picture, Jay Varma, is that she's turning back from stone into a human being. Now, in the second version of Ahalya, the later version, she is extremely ashamed. She didn't even know she was being seduced by Indra, and there's a shame to her story. Whereas the original story, there isn't that kind of shame. In fact, in the original story, she doesn't even become stone. And I thought this painting was an interesting juxtaposition because she's turning back into human from the stone, but her face has this very interesting, almost defiant expression where she's like, fine, you turned me into stone, now I've come back into a woman, but ultimately the world is unjust to women anyway. So what has changed? I thought, that was a nice play on both these stories.
Manu, so I have two questions. My first one is, I think there are lots of people in the audience who'd want to go and read your books, and then they'll want to read all your books. So any order you advise on reading your books?
If you're not typically a reader of history, and you're just dipping your toes for the first time, my third book is a collection of essays called The Courtesan, the Mahatma, and the Italian Brahmin. That might be a good place to start because each essay is about 4 or 5 pages at most, so it won't overwhelm the reader. You can dip in anywhere you want, dip out whenever you want, keep going back and forth to the book as and when it suits you. That would be a good place to start. Then my second book, which is one story, but told over 300 pages.
If I may, the hardcore Manu Pillai fans were disappointed with the third book, also because they said, it's too fragmented, but I understand what you're saying. Because this is like a wonderful story. It's like a whole thing, but
that was precisely it, because I'd go for events and so on, and the question you asked, right? Kids would often come up saying that, look, we're not used to reading history. We liked your session. We're interested. But every time we look at a heavy tome, we're a bit overwhelmed by the idea of reading something of 700 pages. So I said, fine, this is addressed, that third book is addressed to beginners in a sense, nothing that overwhelms you. Then you transition to the second book, which is a 300-page book on one story, 5 centuries covered in 300 odd pages. That's also brisk. It's a very brisk pace.
Which one is
That's called Rebel Sultans. It's a history of the Deccan, from Alauddin Khilji's time to Shivaji's time. And then perhaps you can read Ivory Throne in my fourth book, which are slightly more stout and sort of very meaty, and they meander through the stories in interesting ways. So yeah, there are multiple levels to this book. Sometimes it goes back to the 18th century, comes back to the 20th century. So that I would put for the final part of the journey.
Thank you. And my second question, if you were to list one or two or maybe even more of your favorite historical places in India.
Historical places, that's
Places
actually
or
figures.
which have given you stories. Like for example, earlier I think you mentioned the Tipu Sultan's murals. So I mean, I think it's, we do so much of traveling abroad and then we must go and see historical places, right? But I think we just don't do that much justice to India.
One place I definitely go is Bijapur in Karnataka, because it used to be till the 17th century the seat of the Adil Shahi dynasty. And there are some magnificent buildings there, including the Gol Gumbaz, which is one of the biggest domes in the entire world, constructed in the 17th century. Very offbeat for lots of tourists. I don't know why, because the city is packed with monuments, packed with graves, including of Afzal Khan, who went to kill Shivaji and all of that. That's an incomplete grave, but each building has amazing stories attached to it. That is one place I would definitely visit. I love going to, actually, in Tamil Nadu also, there's so much to discover, right? Like so many temples and spaces, and I still remember, the thing is, you don't get time to really explore these spaces on your own terms and calmly. In Madurai, I remember going and it was crowded, so you end up coming out quickly. But I remember seeing 3 pillars which were fascinating. One was Arjuna becoming Arjuni, in that story from the Mahabharata. And you have 3 pillars which show his body changing. So in the first pillar, he's a man. In the second pillar, he's got the body of a woman, but the face of a man. And then he becomes Arjuni. And just those 3 pillars are telling you so much over there, so much that is fascinating. Imagine the entire temple and every sculpture and every corner of the temple. So I think spaces, sometimes in our own neighborhood, in our own state, are enough to go and visit. It's just that we are so accustomed to thinking of going far away for tourist purposes that we forget that our own backyard sometimes have rather remarkable spots and sites.
Yes, Manjiva?
Manu, can I just ask a question? Would you be open to going with a group of people who were keen to do a trip and guiding them through some historical segment that you felt would be relevant, interesting?
I've actually been asked this before, but every time I've been asked, I've either been finishing a book or doing something else, and therefore said no. But yes, it's definitely interesting, because I've done this privately with friends of my own. In Kerala recently, for example, a friend of mine and me, we covered 6 temples in about 12 hours. And it was fascinating. Again, one on the hills, tribal goddess, one somewhere in the plains, Shiva, one almost fortified, this big old temple, another places by the sea. It was just amazing, those 12 hours of just going through that and seeing the place. But yeah, doing that on a more sustained, calmer kind of pace with a group is feasible.
What I'm going to do is I'm going to take your details and send you a request. And then we'll give you enough time when you're free to do it. And then we'd love to do it.
Sure, with pleasure.
Okay, thanks.
Manu, this is on this side.
Ah.
So you mentioned curiosity has been with a lot of questions. I was just wanted to compliment what Roshni was asking. What are the unexplored areas or regions that still invoke your curiosity and you're still figuring out your answers, Manu?
More than regions or places, it's the people in history that really animate me. Because in some ways, it's also a study of human character, right? How do people respond to power? How does great power corrupt people or not corrupt people? How do people deal with losing power? How do people deal with oppression? How do people resist? Human character under positions of stress, it can be stress in the form of power, it can be stress where you are the victim, but how human beings respond to historical dynamics is of great fascination to me. That's why I think historical figures often speak to me a lot more, and I'm able to construct the past through their eyes because I take on their stories as individuals. In the Courtesan, the Mahatma and the Italian Brahmin, I think the first essay I start with is about a sannyasi in Madurai in the 17th century. And I found his story absolutely fascinating because this man was actually born in Italy in an aristocratic family. He was related to the Pope and so on. He becomes a missionary, a Christian father, and comes to India. And he discovers that why am I selling them a faith that they don't recognize? I have to speak to them in their culture, in their idiom. So he starts wearing a punul like a Brahmin. He starts dressing in saffron robes. He starts learning Tamil and Sanskrit. And he presents the Bible as the fifth Veda. And he starts eating vegetarian food sitting on the floor from a plantain leaf and so on. And he innovates and that results in basically a form of Tamil Catholicism where they still wear that kind of color and they're still very, for want of a better word, very Hinduized. So I find interesting people like that quite, amazing to discover and sort of investigate because it's about human beings and their creativity and their capacity to negotiate the world. Even all these bhakti poets and their poetry, behind all the talk of God, there are actually intellectual ideas. There is a lot of thought that is going through their minds, and they're trying to express that. That, I think, attracts me a great deal. So more than regions and places, it's historical figures as individuals in their time that I'm drawn to.
I actually have, sorry?
After that, I'll come.
Can I just check where we are? One more question.
But we'll take hers also. Two questions.
Okay.
Can I ask?
There's
Yeah, after you.
Manjima and
Yeah.
the person with the mic. After
Good
that,
evening,
Manjima.
Manu.
Manjima, go.
I'm really sorry. No, actually, of course, you've done this quite a bit, and it's very interesting. You started talking about it as well today. But my question basically was that most of history tends to be focused on kings, on heroes that we focus on their lives, and we kind of look at everything through their lens. How much of material do you think there is out there, or what are the possibilities of actually writing a history of people, of ordinary, everyday people that could perhaps give us a sense of what society really was like, and not just, from the perspective of the kings and the sultans and everyone?
It depends on where you're looking, right? So if you look at a lot of the written material, which is usually in courtly languages, so it'll be in courtly Sanskrit, courtly Persian, courtly Telugu, one of those elite things that were used for elite literature. A lot of the written material is in that because literacy wasn't our strong point. Even now we're not a 100% literate country. So 200 years ago, literacy was usually the preserve of the elites. So what we see in written records is often the elite perspective. The perspective of the masses, as it were, comes through in a lot of oral history, which is why religious worship practices matter, which is why the songs that used to be sung in paddy fields when people were working, those matter. Collective memory matters. Now, the interesting thing is, again, collective memory will have issues. The dates won't be right. It won't be chronological history as we understand it. It won't be footnoted or anything. It won't be like that. But again, it's trying to tell you something. These songs and the lore, the mythology that they have is trying to tell you something. So, for example, there's 1857, right? The Great Rebellion. For the longest time, studies on 1857 focused on the leaders of the movement. Rani Lakshmibai, Tatya Tope, all the leaders and the elites who were at the face of the movement. But increasingly, scholarship has shown that many of these elites very grudgingly came on to lead the movement. It was actually the lay peasant, the lay soldier, people on the ground who had grievances built up structurally against the British, nameless figures, just large masses of peasants who were not happy with British rule, who used the language of religion and justice and so on to build up that energy. So you're able to find material like that. I think there are limitations because so much of our history is produced at elite levels, especially written archival material and so on. So finding a kind of mass history is not always easy, but it's possible. And sometimes it's possible simply by identifying the gaps and the silences rather than identifying actual material that will give you the information. Because when you see a huge gap sometimes, that alone is proof that there's something there worth investigating.
That's very interesting.
Thank you. Thank you.
Said last question there. The last question, please.
Good evening, Manu. I find our history is quite selective. And in our history, we find certain figures are totally ignored or I'll say very, very less discussed. Like one Mughal Badshah, I remember, Dara Shikoh. We don't find something about him. We find very little about the women rulers like Razia Sultana or any other ruler of at that point of time. We find very little history or written evidences how uh, the people of this Kalkaji Delhi, they survived that period. So, do you have any intentions to bring out those things also into the light for the common people?
Well, not on, not in a proactive way, which is that the way it works is usually I have something I'm interested in discovering. That'll lead me to something else. Then I'll discover something else through my research, which will lead to another book or something like that. That's usually how these books end up being written. Each is something I gravitate to either because I'm interested in the theme, either because I'm interested in the characters or something or the other, or that region is of interest to me. In general, I haven't focused on North India because there are plenty of people doing that. I'm not very interested, therefore, in joining that particular bandwagon. My focus is mostly towards the South. Dara Shikoh, if you're interested, there's a very good book by Supriya Gandhi, who wrote I think the finest biography on Dara Shikoh that exists to this date. Others, yeah, again, depends on whose books you're reading and to what level they've given prominence to these figures. But yeah, there's always material. Something, if you look for it, you'll always find the relevant book for even historical figures we don't necessarily talk much about.
May I? Oh.
There was one question there, I thought.
Okay.
Actually, behind you.
Okay. So I don't have a history question. I have a Manu question to ask you.
Oh dear.
I've never spellbound, firstly.
Thank you.
Secondly, have you had personal dates or outings with friends where they sit you down and say, hey, one more story, Manu? Have you had that happen to you?
Well, in my wild days of my youth when I was in college, and I would, we would have these rather drunk parties, like all young people of my time did at least. There would be evenings where I would sit and give Maha lectures that went on for several hours. And in fact, there's actually an American show called Drunk American History, where all the characters are drunk and they're actually enacting history while they're drunk, and it is entertaining as hell. So I can see why my friends used to enjoy that.
So the quick question from me. I've read this book, Palace of Illusions by Chitra Banerjee. Very interesting take on Mahabharata through Draupadi's eyes. So books like that, or The Pregnant King by Devdutt Patnaik, books like that, do they threaten history or will they help history?
Would they what?
Threaten history
No, I don't think
or
they threaten.
would they help?
No, look, I don't think anything threatens history. We shouldn't be thin-skinned about things, right? Everything is about people exploring their creativity. We have so many versions of the Ramayana. We have versions in which Rama and Sita are siblings, not even husband and wife. There are so many versions of it. There's a Mapala Ramayanam, a Muslim Ramayanam in Kerala, where Shurpanakha goes to Rama and propositions him and says, marry me. And Rama says, no, but I'm already married, so I can't. And Shurpanakha says, but the Sharia says you can marry again. You can take 2-3 wives. So there's a Ramayana in which the Sharia is also cited. There are so many versions of the epics themselves. Why should we restrain anybody from retelling the stories from fresh perspectives in today's world? One should never be thin-skinned about these things. Even with history books, right? There are a lot of bad history books that are written, but it's fine because it cultivates an interest. And for every bad history book that will be written, someone will write a good one. So I don't think we should be threatened by any of these things. Good will always shine. Mediocre will always look mediocre. Bad will sink. That's typically how it works. There's no reason to prevent people from doing what they want to do. Let them. It's a free country.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Manu. Thank you so much.
Thank
It's
you,
been dazzling.
Mr. Pillai. Thank you, Mr. Pillai and Colonel Gopal, for that engaging conversation. I'm sure many of us would want that to continue. May I now request Mrs. Kiran Nadar, Chairman KNMA and Trustee Shiv Nadar Foundation, to hand over a memento of our gratitude to Mr. Manu Pillai.
Thank you so much. Yeah.